Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Direct-to-Consumer Clinical Trials with Innovative Digital Platforms, presented by Amazon Web Services. I'm Lita Sands, and I'll be your moderator for this session. I am thrilled to be joined by an amazing panel of speakers today, and you can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Now, just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there's no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure that your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. And time permitting, we will follow the presentation with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. So, again, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm Lita Sands, and in my role at AWS, I'm responsible for life sciences, business development, and strategy. I've been in the industry for 20 years, with our company for 4 years, and I've just been amazed to see the transformation that's been enabled by technology on behalf of patients around the globe. And certainly there's been no area, I think, that's been more positively impacted than clinical trials. And even before the pandemic, traditional clinical trials in person were really increasing in cost and duration while struggling to recruit and retain participants. And furthermore, because of the location of many academic medical centers, patients in rural and underserved communities, not just in the US, but globally, were often unable to participate, which really created underrepresented study groups. But an interesting thing happened last year, and according to Tufts, in response to the pandemic, companies that made an investment in cloud technology, IoT, and AI/ML were able to move 56% of their clinical trials to some form of virtual, avoiding a huge disruption in drug development. Now today, many organizations have the ability to implement digital engagement platforms in combination with traditional in-person visits in a very much a multimodal way that is driven really by the needs of the therapy. This approach can really significantly increase and optimize patient experiences and also increase accessibility to a broader and a more diverse population. So today we're going to learn specifically how the Duke Heart Center launched a fully digital, decentralized clinical study leveraging Deloitte's ConvergeHEALTH My Path for Clinical platform powered by AWS, specifically to study the impact of COVID-19 on athletes' heart health. And today I'm going to be introducing you to a series of folks here who really represent the different aspects of transformation. It is more than technology. It's really about people, process, and technology. And the folks that you're going to meet here today represent all aspects of this. So now I'm just going to turn to people to give a short introduction for themselves. So Dr. Patel, can I turn to you first, please?
Sure, thanks, and it's exciting to be here and really appreciate you all tuning in. My name is Manesh Patel. I'm the Chief of Cardiology at Duke and co-director of the Heart Center. I'm also a member of the Duke Clinical Research Institute.
Thank you. Jen?
Thanks, Lisa. I'm delighted to be here today. My name's Jen Goldsack. I'm the CEO here at the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME. And our conversation today brings together a few things that are really important to me. So obviously our mission here at DIME to advance the safe, effective, ethical, and equitable use of digital technologies to optimize health. The team is clearly putting that into practice. But the athlete study is near and dear to my heart. For folks on the line who may not know, I'm actually an Olympian. So I competed at the 2008 Olympic Games as a rower. I was in a two-person boat. And I remember the importance of things like detraining. And so this is a particularly interesting and important study as far as I'm concerned. So delighted to be on the line today and participating in the conversation.
Thank you. And Ryan?
Sure. Thanks, Lita, for having me, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. My name is Ryan Hoffmeister. I'm a managing director in our ConvergeHEALTH practice. which is our software and solutions business inside the four walls of Deloitte's life sciences and healthcare practice. I have the privilege of leading our life sciences technology portfolio and work very closely with Dr. Patel and the Duke team to enable this study.
Thank you. So with that, what I'd like to do now is turn to you, Dr. Patel, and ask you if you could tell us a little bit about this study. What was the initial purpose of this? How did you land on the idea of using mobile? And I know that you don't refer to it as virtual. We talk about augmented. Maybe you can expand on that.
Yeah, thanks. Lots of great topics there. Maybe I'll just start with the study first, and then we can think about how we conduct studies. And I often tell our fellows or our teams that what you've already heard is one of the critical issues that we've been doing in thinking about research is before even the pandemic, we needed to work to get closer to our patients, meet people where they are, meet the community where they are, and understand that there's an actual important health equity opportunity in that people might not get access to important clinical research or opportunities for therapies. So before, in that background, that in 2018, 2019, Christy Cornett, actually, who is the mother of Joel Cornett and has funded this study, and the Cornett Foundation was started after, unfortunately, Joel Cornett, who was an athlete at Butler, passed away suddenly. And so they started a foundation to say, how can we prevent this from happening again? And an important study in itself, just to better understand heart disease, but what I'll call athletic heart disease, or things that happen to athletes. And in that setting, when she came to talk to me about this, we said, one of the things we don't know, and we've already heard, there's some amazing performance that athletes do, but we don't fully understand why some people, whether it's deconditioning or other things, have differences between how the hearts look, how they evolve. It's really hard sometimes, we as cardiologists think of hearts very similarly, we learn about them, but most of our patients aren't 6'10" or 5'4", and they aren't performance athletes that do all these things. So when we see their pictures or evaluate them, there's a wide range of things we might see, and what's within the range of normal, what's within the range of not normal is sometimes complicated with athletes. And so when she first came to us, we said we want to better understand how we could learn about athletes' hearts. And then in that setting, unfortunately, as we all now know, COVID happened. And since COVID started, there was even a bigger mandate to better understand how some of these collegiate athletes were being asked to go out and participate in sports, but what was the risk, whether they got COVID or not, and what was the cardiovascular risk of COVID. And so in that setting, we started to better understand the hearts of athletes, as we called it, by seeing if we can get symptoms from athletes, understand what testing they were undergoing, and start to understand that in this program. As that study was going on, we also had conversations with a variety of other sports medicine physicians who actually had started a registry called ORCA, sort of outcomes of cardiovascular events and outcomes in patients with athletes. And so together, the two groups started working together to say, how can we better understand that? The Cornett Foundation said, this is really exciting. How can we do this quickly? And even in the best of hands, things don't move as fast as we want, but the pandemic has really, taught us to move quickly. So we partnered with them, Deloitte and ConvergeHEALTH and others, to say, one of the things we would need to do is to get to people around the country directly to them digitally, if we could, and easy to be able to engage with platform where they could provide consent, remembering that athletes are very careful about what their hearts are like, and they want to be their images careful, like all of us. We want to protect our health information. And they also want to be able to understand, get something back. When you're in a research study, you want to know, what is it in it for me? And so how can I better learn about my own symptoms? Does this help other athletes? How do I participate? So those were some of the early sort of thoughts behind the hearts of athletes. So we proposed that we would study 300 athletes, 200 who had cardiac MRIs, or if they hadn't had cardiac MRIs, we would do these tests for these athletes, if possible, at their local place, see what their symptoms were if they had after COVID, to see if they're prolonged, if they're having continuous symptoms, and then find what I'll call control athletes, athletes who didn't have COVID, who would also tell us their symptoms, and we could also have a control group. So I'll stop there. It's a lot at once, but that's sort of the background of the study.
No, that's super helpful. So as you embarked on this idea of moving to virtual, and it is amazing the speed at which you were able to do this. What were some of the major considerations when designing the platform for this study? How do you yourself disseminate between virtual or augmented trials?
Yeah, and I guess, the word virtual is interesting, right? So we think about in clinical trials, like what I often say is, and I'm not sure this is the perfect term either, but the term decentralized has been used, or directly to the participant. however we can directly have that. Remember that for many years we've done research where we call people on the phone and ask them how they're doing. See, did you have any pain? How is your symptoms? And so we've been doing research, I would say, directly to participants with telephones and things for many years. What happened in COVID is we said we want to do as much, if not all of it, if we can, through some sort of a platform. Now, I call it augmented or hybrid, or we realize that people still want trusted sources. So even the athletes look to their team coaches, team docs to say, is this a good thing for me to be in? People want to know if their colleagues are going to be in studies. So we want to build a community where people interact with a platform that they feel is trusted, where they can get information about the study and they can put information in about themselves. And so part of what we did here was to build a platform with our colleagues from Deloitte that tried to make the burden for the athlete as least as possible. Once a week, check in. If you're feeling good, no problem, answer these questions. If you're not feeling good, you have to answer some more questions. Did you have this evaluation? Are you practicing? Are you participating? If not, what are those issues? Additionally, we have an electronic consent, and we have ways in which once you've had a heart study of some sort, we can get that centrally identified and reviewed.
That's really interesting. One of the key takeaways I just heard from you is this idea, as we all think about how do we successfully recruit participants for trials, it's equally as important to think about who is their system of care around them and what does that ecosystem look like and how do these things work collaboratively. So that's really interesting. Were there any special media outreaches, say, to folks who may be coaches or other folks influential in this community?
Yeah, so when we first started trying to put this together, recognizing that we're sitting here at the end of 2021, and in essence, a lot of this was happening in the fall of 2020 after the pandemic started, and let's say the collegiate sports in that fall were happening. Once we talked to the Cornett Foundation, it took us a while to build the platform and go through institutional review and build the protocol. And around August to September, we launched with going directly to athletes, but also having sort of web blasts and different things to engage, also telling team docs and word of mouth and a variety of other news stories, which I think helped. And we've had different people sort of going to the websites and other things to engage, but we also have people talking to each other, as we often do, and saying, hey, if you're on a team and you're interested, these are things. Any Division I athlete, we would like to make it even more, but we're just thinking about the first go with the study. So that's sort of how we started. I think I've been talking about the hearts of athletes, but obviously I conduct and participate in a lot of cardiovascular studies, and we think about one of the things I think is important to think is figuring out for each study or each possible participant what it is they get out of it, what it is that they're used to doing, and how can you mirror as close as you can to the kinds of activities they do to get that information and to then do the intervention. It depends what the intervention is, right? In this study, the intervention is learning a little bit about their symptoms and potentially giving them some information about what we identify when we do tests or studies of their heart. And so there's some value, hopefully, for the athlete, but there's also hopefully value to the community as we build what I'll call a national library of athletic hearts and what they look like and how we can learn from that.
That's pretty amazing. Now, I know when you first launched, you were, of course, actively monitoring people who are registering and what that experience looked like. And you found some interesting thing that caused you to just pause and make an amendment and go through the IRB process again. Would you mind expanding on what you learned during that process and how you pivoted?
Yeah, a lot of things change fast, as we know in this last year and a half. Lots of things are changing fast, as we all know, right? And so what we know, at least I live in North Carolina, and we're blessed to be a state with a lot of people that are thankfully serving in the armed forces. And so we realize that there's not just collegiate athletes, but a lot of young adults that are physically fit, that are serving in the Army, that are also generally athletic and are also potentially getting COVID or also getting vaccines and a variety of other things. And so we said, as we were going through this, there were a lot of potential participants who were in the armed forces who were saying, hey, could we participate? And so we thought, after having the conversation, that that's a really great feedback. That's not unreasonable at all. And obviously we would broaden the criteria to get not just athletic individuals that are in the in college, but athletic individuals that are serving our country. And so we placed an amendment so that if people in the armed services wanted to participate, they could too.
That's awesome. Now, what was it like going through the IRB process? Is it different when you're using augmented or decentralized trial mechanisms versus, as you were saying before, traditional phone? What's different, and maybe what are some tips for other folks who are thinking about doing this as well?
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges with any IRB, digital or otherwise, let's say, and that's a good thing, right? Remember, our IRBs or institutional review groups are aimed to try to protect the participants. And so the goals of what most IRBs want to do is make sure that we're protecting the participants by securing their information, making sure that there's some potential benefit, not harm to the person, and that there's some safety controls in place. So whenever we do that, we think about that broadly in any program. And in this program, for example, it's pretty minimal risk to an athlete to participate in the study. We thought, you consent to saying, yes, I want to share my information. I'm willing to answer questions about how I feel, whether I'm short of breath, if I'm feeling my heart racing, those kinds of things. But it is individual information, so some of the security concerns exist. And so we did work with Deloitte a lot to make sure that there was important security things in place so that both the athletes and the IRB felt like that was placed, that the informed consent was truly an informed consent. Was it in understandable language? Was it covering all the potential benefits and risks of a study? Those are all, I think, standard things. But in a digital world, the way that works sometimes is that first somebody has to express interest, and then you have to contact them to make sure that that's actually a person. And then you have to make sure that that actual person contacting you is able to consent and participate. So those sound funny, but those are, really important things that participate, because I hadn't thought of them either when I started doing the study. But once you put up a website and say, hey, we want people to download an app and participate in a study, you have to do a variety of things to make sure that that's what's happening.
No, that's super helpful. Thank you so much. So moving along that stream of thought, I want to turn to Jen next. So full disclosure, Jen and I have now worked together in various capacities. It's probably been maybe 7-8 years now. And I met her when she was the project manager for the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which was a public-private partnership between Duke and the FDA to help accelerate the use of mobile devices in trials as well as novel endpoints. And fast forward to today, as you heard, she is the head of the Digital Medicine Advisory Group, DIME, and they've launched a number of really amazing studies this year. One is novel endpoints to be able to understand nocturnal scratching for atopic dermatitis with companies like J&J and AbbVie and Pfizer. And the other that we're participating in, which is helping to create a roadmap and a decision framework for the use of sensors and sensor integration across the entire ecosystem, which once again will help accelerate the use of these studies through mobile or virtual platforms. And it was only through this that I discovered after all these years that Jen actually is an Olympic athlete. So I continue to learn so much from you, Jen, and maybe you could give us a little bit more insight. We talked a bit about helping to meet people where they are across all socioeconomic spectrum and all technological capabilities. What do you think are some of the best practices for the development and design of virtual studies?
Really good question, and a big question. And I think the most important thing to do is to actually sort of stop and pause for a second and ask ourselves, what's the problem we're trying to solve for by including decentralized elements into our trial? So the example, Manesh, as you described it, sort of with COVID was, obviously we had to have trial continuity. We had to try and think about maintaining the resilience of the system. That was a huge driver to do that. And it resulted in an all hands on deck and phenomenal learnings and experience and advancement of our field. I sincerely hope that we leave the specter of COVID behind us in the not too distant future. And then the question is, what are the problems that this powerful new sort of set of tools in the toolbox can help us solve for within the sort of the clinical trials enterprise? Despite the fact I lead an organization called the Digital Medicine Society, I'm certainly not a tech determinist. More tech isn't better. More solved problems is better. Right. So I think about when I was a student athlete at uni and you don't have any time. So in the context of this particular project, right, how are we minimizing burden on the participant? Whether that participant is a student athlete or whether that participant is someone who is both a mother to young children and a carer to their aging parents, and someone who works, someone who is sick, and you want them to volunteer into your study. we have to do everything possible to leverage the full suite of capabilities to reduce the volunteer participant burden. And I'm at the point now where I never say participant in clinical trials without putting volunteer in front, because we have to remember that the burden that we often, because it's our process and because this is how we do things, and haven't you heard, we're terribly regulated, it just, we are, I think, dismissive of that. So, I always think about what's the problem we're trying to solve for, whether it's participation burden, whether patients actually tell us that the most interesting facet of their condition is not something we can currently measure using a scan or using a paper tool or using a sort of clinician observed measure. Maybe it is something that we finally can measure with sensors, right? Maybe it's something that actually, if we weren't relying on these tiny snapshots of data during a clinic visit, and we could have a more holistic view of how the patient is faring during their everyday lives with a much more sort of frequently sampled, it doesn't even have to be continuous, right? But a much more frequently sampled measure, we can start to have a much better understanding of things like disease mechanisms, digital phenotypes. We can identify better responders using these things. Like, to me, before we get a sort of distracted by the shiny new technologies, by the ability of data to flow and not be locked in a file cabinet, by our computing capabilities to be able to run new analytics on these huge data sets, let's actually stop and think about what's the patient. In fact, what's the volunteer participant problem we're trying to solve for? What's the investigator and site team's problem we're trying to solve for? They are horribly overburdened right now. And what's the data quality and scientific challenge we're trying to solve for? That's where we should start. And that's how sort of development and design of protocols using decentralized elements, that's where we should start, and they should cascade from the problems we're trying to solve for.
Excellent. Thank you. That's super helpful. And as we've had many conversations, some of these engagements can be relatively straightforward. It can involve text messages, it can involve voice assistants. But to your point, let's start with understanding the volunteers. And and many of them will have disease states where they have already a cognitive burden. So the idea of making it simple, not having complex devices that they have to manage, even making sure batteries are charged or having access to broadband, all of these things really need to be taken into account when you think about how to get access to these volunteers and make it simple and easy for them to participate, correct?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And, what we do know, and you outlined this in your opening remarks, Lita, is that, pre-pandemic, we were not optimized then. We had challenges and pain points across a number of different levels. Like, we all know that 1 in 5 trials ends, and a molecule that may work gets put back on a shelf with no answers about whether it performs or not, because we cannot recruit patients to that study, right? That is staggering if you think about it. What have we put back on the shelf because we can't design things in such a way that we can find the right patients and we can make it palatable for our clinical colleagues to actually engage in research, and that we can make it enticing for volunteer participants to actually get involved. 1 in 5 molecules goes back on the shelf with no answer about whether they work. Just imagine, it's almost unethical, right, for us not to be using these new tools in the toolbox to do better.
Yeah, that's so true. Please.
I was just going to say, it's great comments, and I fully agree on many of them. And you might even think about the trial landscape as I see it beyond the study I just described. We do so many of them, and there are 2 streams I would suggest that, again, irregardless of the tools we're talking about, there's 2 streams of issues. One is that most clinicians and physicians in the healthcare system is working in one stream of what they're used to doing, and people are living over here in a different stream. And so there's clinical delivery of healthcare, and it's not tied at all to the clinical research enterprise. And so any integration between the 2 will help you both engaging both the participants, volunteer participants, but also reducing the burden on both sides of being duplicative. And just so much double work is happening. So whether it's asking the symptoms, whether it's finding out if the patient really has the disease, whether it's identifying what's the value to either side, I would argue that the first low-hanging sort of just opportunity is reducing the duplication that happens with clinical trials, and participatorily why there is such a reduction in people wanting to volunteer. The second, which I think is really the big message for me, at least in cardiovascular disease, but I would argue in most of research, is it's the democratization of access to studies. If you said to me, what are we really doing We're giving people an opportunity from where they are, if we can do it, to get involved. And then we have to do a lot on making sure we can keep them involved and get them close to all the other things. But I'll use the cardiovascular landscape, and I participate in many of these. Unfortunately, 25% of participants in cardiovascular trials are women. Less than 10% are from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. And one could argue that's another reason, even when therapies get proven, that they don't get used, because they don't get used because the people in front of you don't look like the people that might have been in the study.
Yeah, very poignant points, and well said. So there is, it seems like the silver lining of COVID, it's helped to accelerate the use of technology so that we can essentially, in many respects too, help the promise of 21st century cures come to life. And Jen, I want to applaud you for having also so many regulators participate in your work streams too, so that we can move forward together as quickly as possible. And Ryan, what's really amazing is now technology enables us to have so much. As you heard a lot, we have speed, we have greater participation, and we talked a few times that the cloud, the AWS cloud, enables the security and the interoperability, so we can deal with this information in a way that is compliant and really has, of course, our volunteers' best interests at heart. It's the most security sensitive information there is. So tell us a little bit more about how the ConvergeHEALTH MyPath for Clinical platform is supporting the Hearts of Athletes study.
Sure, absolutely happy to, and I couldn't agree more with some of the comments. First, just around the need to really think about kind of the participants holistically and really meet both their needs and the clinician needs. And it's not necessarily a good segue to talking about technology, but I'll go a little bit into the actual underlying platform itself. Our MyPath for Clinical platform is really based on an asset that we've been working with clients on over the last 3.5, 4 years, called our Connected Patient Hub. And we really started to engineer our Connected Patient Hub 4 years ago to really think about how do we want to engage with patients differently from a biopharmaceutical landscape perspective, engage with them, help them share and connect in more digital ways with their caregivers to kind of surround them and surround their care, and also be able to share that information that they're collecting with their professional care teams or the needs of use cases like this for studies in ways that are both secure and compliant with the regulations, both here and internationally as well. And so in this specific configuration of MyPath for Clinical that we deployed for Duke, we built mobile applications based on top of microservices that sit within AWS. And so these microservices we're able to easily deploy anywhere that we need to based on AWS serverless architecture. So a very low cost, pay per transaction type architecture. These allow Dr. Patel and the team to both register the patient, do a number of things that Dr. Patel talked about, collect consent electronically from student athletes, really geographically dispersed across the entire U.S., collect daily symptom surveys, ease that cognitive burden on the students because a notification is going to come up on their phone when they need to submit the next survey, and they don't have to think about, oh, I've got to log into a computer, I have to go out and fill out a physical form. And so the platform really enables all those tasks to happen in a way that's very easy to consume for the volunteer participant, Jen. I like that. And really also enables that data then to flow seamlessly back in near real time to Dr. Patel and his team, allowing them through an investigator portal to really see how student athletes are progressing through the trial. And that's an important part as well, we believe, over the longer term as you look out, to really start being able to look at adherence to protocol over larger and more complicated trials and start flagging earlier in the process when a study participant may be going off that protocol or start being not adherent to the protocol, really getting better data and really reducing the overall cycle time of collecting these trials.
Thank you. We've worked together very closely for these past 4 years also. And ConvergeHEALTH spans a lot of areas that are really important to precision medicine and a lot of the things we've been discussing, implicit real-world evidence. And what I love about the ConvergeHEALTH platform is it's really easy for enterprises to be able to implement it and get up and running pretty quickly without having to invest in a lot of experts, whether it's a data scientist or an advanced programmer, for example. And it comes with the full stack of things as you described. So, when you think about in this particular area in terms of decentralized clinical trials going forward, how do you see Deloitte helping the industry to move forward just in general when it comes to different types of clinical trials?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of different areas that our platform support, everything from direct to patient through to real world evidence, and even some of the underlying mechanisms of data flowing through clinical trials, really simplifying the overall back-end data platforms. For the industry holistically, I think that the MyPath platform enabled Dr. Patel and his team to reach really an audience that it was able to go nationally very quickly without needing to set up all the infrastructure around paper-based forms or collection of that data that otherwise would take a lot of man hours, a lot of resources. And so a lot of our focus is taking the work out of the work, enabling that direct-to-patient engagement, and really making sure that the data that's collected is coming through in a secure, compliant fashion.
Thank you. A lot of the customers I talk to at some point, they almost view the idea of moving to virtual as risky because they see perhaps it's what we do today is, I'm not going to call it the gold standard, but it's the way we've always done it.
Yep.
When we were preparing for this, you shared with us your own personal journey being involved in a clinical trial and what the frustrations were like as a patient. Curious if you wouldn't mind sharing just a little bit of what that experience is like and how a platform like ConvergeHEALTH can help change that very rapidly.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to, and at the risk of getting too deeply personal, I've been living with a rare disease for the last 20 years. Luckily, it hasn't impacted me greatly, but I've been always on the lookout for treatments and things that are coming out. It's a disease that doesn't currently have a treatment that's available. And so, when I start thinking about it, I think about my own experiences through this. I think we have to, take technology aside for a second, really start all the way back at how does a patient understand what's even available out there. To Dr. Patel's point, in speaking to this, with my clinical care team, right, they're on one side of the house. They're not they're not involved in the clinical trials, and so. Even a lot of the burden up front being put on the patient to actually go out and identify and find what's out there, it is a barrier that I think we have to address in this whole process as well. And then obviously the process of going through this, and again, I won't name the company, but this was for a major pharmaceutical company, the process of driving 2 hours to a clinical site, reading, and I actually did read the 50 pages of forms that I had to sign and fill out, do a couple of different lab tests, go back a couple of weeks later. And by the way, all this was back and forth over unsecured email as I was passing all my health information back and forth. And so, that experience is something that, while it was something I was willing to go through and that I was looking to do, that is a huge upfront burden on the patient and a burden on, my care team, because I was asking them questions that they didn't necessarily know because it was outside of standard of care. That I think we need to think about kind of holistically as we go through this process, even up front before the participants even enrolled and starting on the protocol.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that journey. I found that really insightful. And Dr. Patel, we've talked a bit about how there's a burden on the physician too. And obviously, if we're able to roll out platforms like this nationally and globally, not every study can be 100% virtual. There's going to be times where patients have to come in, or volunteers now as we're calling them, to meet with that care team. So implicit in that is we want more physicians to be able to participate, to be able to join studies, run studies. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what some of the barriers are there and what you think needs to happen for them to be able to more fully participate?
Yeah, thanks. Rightly so, we have a variety of things in place to make sure that we protect volunteer participants in clinical research, and that usually includes making sure that we've got clinicians or physicians that have training in good clinical practice in research, that understand protection of human subjects in research and some of those things. Those are all standards that I'm by no means advocating we change. In fact, one of the things we can talk about is how we can get closer to not just our patients, but the physicians in the clinical community that takes care of our communities, to get that training to them. I think the barriers that also exist beyond just, let's say, making sure you know some of the actual criteria for protecting patients and participating is knowing the research, all the steps of the research, the scale of the research. Remember, one could argue that we've gone through the fifth industrial revolution of this digital world, where we're now breaking everything down into little pieces that people can control and manage. And one could argue that for clinical research, it used to be that we expected the doctor's office with the volunteer participant to do every step of that research. Now it might be that we can talk about how we can inform, just using the case we just heard, but inform the local physician about the study. And the participatory act they need is just to know enough about it to explain it, and to potentially engage in recruiting people, and potentially helping in making sure that if safety events or clinical events happen, that we help report those things, while some of the interventions or other things could be done as close to home as possible, digitally, remotely, all the things we might talk about. So one might say, at least for me, when I think about clinical research, there's sort of three big components. What does the volunteer participant need to know about it? Once they consent, is there an intervention? What is it? And then what are we measuring and follow up? Those are three general sort of things we need to know. The clinician community then needs to think about, how do I support each of those? Do you need to do all of them? Do you do them remotely? How do you help support those areas? And so the more we can break down clinical research into its fundamental parts, the more we can help a broader set of people do that with a variety of solutions. Again, those solutions don't have to be digital, but they can be certainly a variety of solutions that help people do that.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. And Jen, again, coming back to you. So I think what's pretty amazing is that there are guidelines that are published out there already by city. We've talked at length about ConvergeHEALTH as a platform that enterprises can adapt very rapidly and get up and running. So as always, a lot of the technology solution is out there in a way that's secure and compliant with regulators. And we work together a lot, my role at AWS, to help advance the industry. But it always comes down to people and process. So we talked about some of the gaps earlier, but what do you think are the major hurdles that the industry needs to overcome, I'd say the next 12 to 18 months, to really move forward and embrace this more rapidly?
Really good question. I want to go back to what we were discussing a little bit earlier around this idea of it's too risky. And I hope that COVID may have changed that risk calculation, right? We are not, without these tools in the toolbox, we are not sufficiently resilient as an organization in order to weather anything like this that may happen again. I think we need to get comfortable with a recalculation of the risks of doing this, i.e. embracing the digitization of trials versus the risks of not. We go back to this idea of 1 in 5 trials already fold. There's been a whole discovery pipeline. A molecule has been brought forward and all of that investment goes back on the shelf because we can't get the people in the door. And meanwhile, think about the digital experience of just being a human being in this day and age, right? When was the last time you walked into a bank? I've bought houses, cars, all sorts of things, started a business, and have not set foot into a bank. That is my expectation as a consumer. I expect things to be personalized, from the irritating banner ads I get and the crap that comes up in my Instagram, all the way through to what should my next Audible be? What other podcast should I be listening to? And what's on for this weekend on Netflix? This is what our expectations are. We expect services. We expect personalization. We expect to be able to do it on our own time from anywhere. And if we aren't meeting those expectations that an individual can largely get in just about every single aspect of their life, except for healthcare. But you know what? Healthcare is moving in that direction now. Manesh, you're also a practicing clinician, right? You see this. We are making changes on the care delivery side. If we don't keep pace on the clinical trial side, if we do not do our very best with the highest quality of science, with an eye to inclusion at every juncture, with an eye to experience not just for volunteer participants, but our clinical colleagues, if we aren't thinking about optimizing data quality, so on and so forth, all with an eye on the new digital tools in the toolbox that will actually make us an entity that is not completely defunct in the next 10 years, that's a much greater risk to me. So that's what I think we need to get comfortable with. I think as an industry, we need to get comfortable that the risk calculus has changed. And in my opinion, it is more risky not to do this than it is to do it. And I think that those who lead now will be paid, sort of great dividends over time. They will sort of establish best practices. They will be leading the charge in recruitment. They will have higher quality data if they do it right. And anyone who doesn't go on this journey will be left behind.
No, thank you.
I tend to agree. Sorry, I was just going to say that I think the ways that we think about de-risking it, if you will, for industry right now, is thinking about what exists in clinical trials today and what can we do in a decentralized digital way to help the industry get to the fact that they're building in potential better redundancy, potential better data quality, as you've highlighted. So not only can we talk about how do we get to more participants, how do we reduce the risk. Now it depends on the level of risk, right? A molecule at phase 1 is very different than a molecule in phase 4 after it's approved. And so of course, we're going to try to be thoughtful about where we are in any development program for any product. But my sense is that the opportunity that you're speaking to is very real in the sense that there are 7 to 8 billion people on planet Earth, and a very small fraction of them ever get near a clinical trial. And so that's the opportunity that we potentially have, especially as we think about the broad spectrum of digital engagement and personalization, which I would say exists very much in the things you think about, but exists very simply for our patients, just as simply as even in the most rural or potentially low resource economic areas of just what medications are you taking and what should you be taking and how can we personalize that simple action to integrate you into your healthcare delivery. That's the kind of opportunities that are going to have such a large impact on our population of patients.
Yeah, that's well said. And I think one of the other things that we've observed is we're not talking about digital natives anymore. We're talking about the full spectrum of patients out there. And some of the stats that I've seen show that senior citizens are embracing this now as much as what we'd assume to be, your younger millennials. I think CMS reported that use of virtual medicine for primary care visits went from 4% in January of last year to 43% by April of last year. These are senior citizens, baby boomers. And when I've talked to some folks, they'll say things like, I never really thought I wanted to be able to use telemedicine to meet with my physician, but I found it was phenomenal. I didn't have to drive to the office. I'm not sitting with other sick people in the waiting room. It's efficient with my time. So, as the points you're making, and Jen, we're really talking about now, as everybody got used to working with virtual and having things delivered to their home regarding healthcare, it's now become a consumer experience like many others. So I think that shift in mindset is something that's happening globally for folks. And it's something that's really important for people to understand because many payers and providers are moving to now a digital front door. Let's see how much we can do in that first visit online so we can make what happens after that as efficient and effective as possible for the patient. So these are really, I think, great comments that help us understand holistically what's happening in the ecosystem. And before we turn to the audience for questions, Dr. Patel, just wanted to ask you, the final question is, what's next for the Duke Heart Center? Where do you see these studies going forward?
Well, I'll just say that, we've talked about the hearts of athletes, and again, we really appreciate the support from the Cornett Foundation. Sometimes you need, passion, mission-driven work to get some of these things done, and so I really want to acknowledge their support. But most of the patients I take care of are not 18 to 22, right? They have cardiovascular disease, and as you said, unfortunately, they are somewhere between 50 and 80, and a variety of spectrum of digital interaction. And so what I would argue is that there's a couple of big things that have to be solved in the United States for us to really do this well. One is this belief that tele-research or decentralized trials have anything to do with telehealth. I'm not suggesting telehealth isn't important. I'm not suggesting you're not using some of the same platforms, but there's a variety of laws in the United States that deal with how patients can be taken care of in certain states and not in other certain states, and I understand why that is, because you have to have care local to home when something happens. However, research might allow us to, again, like I said, flatten the planet and let everyone get into trials. And some of that can be done in a decentralized fashion that we are actively working with sponsors on to do large studies in common conditions like heart failure and atrial fibrillation and things. And talk about a place where sensors are really going to be important. Talk about people that have conditions with their heart where we can measure your heart rate now. We can tell what the rhythm is. We can tell if you're short of breath. We can tell if your activity has been reduced based on how much you're moving around. So our opportunity to really speed up discovery, to deliver better health, is going to be linked to our ability to embrace what I'll call this concept of at least getting closer to our volunteer participants to do decentralized.
No, that's excellent. Thank you. And yeah, of course, implicit in all what we're talking about is the ability to increase adherence. So before we keep going, I just want to remind everybody, so on the left, you have the ability to ask any questions you'd like of our panel. So please, if you could go ahead and do that, we're going to be transitioning to that in a moment. And one of the things that I'm always very bullish on is the idea is you change the experience in the clinical trials. The holy grail for the industry has always been, how do we ensure that there is the right migration of clinical trial protocol into clinical practice, right? A lot of physicians really are struggling with that. I think part of it is, when it comes to care, no physician really wants to be overwhelmed by a lot of raw data coming from a patient's watch or app or something like that. It's not really integrated into their standard care and their workflow. So I just want to open this question actually to all three of you, if you have any thoughts on this. When we start to move into then clinical care using tools like this, where do you see the opportunities to kind of help care teams be able to engage better with this data and drive to greater insights? So I'll just ask of all three of you. Anybody like to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I can certainly start, although I maybe I'll let others go first because I've done most of the talking on this. So I'll let others go, and then I can wrap up.
Sure.
So, Brian, go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to say, in the work we've done in some clinical care settings, I think it's important also to give choices to the physicians as to both the modality and the frequency by which they're going to receive data, right? So the burdens on physicians in our current system are massive, and to your point, getting a constant stream of data from patients is something that a lot of physicians have a fairly adverse reaction to. And so I think while it's a helpful tool, also thinking about how to integrate that into the workflow and providing a set of personalized choices for the physician, and also thinking about the workflow in the clinic is a very important concept as it relates to getting that data back. It's an incredibly useful set of data, right? All that phenotypic data that's coming from patients, but it has to be consumable and has to be accessible in the right ways.
Ryan, I want to sort of pull on the thread of sort of workflows. I'm going to say something pretty unexpected, but I mean it top to bottom, which is with all of these new tools and technologies, right, especially things like remote patient monitoring, if all we're doing is shoehorning them into existing workflows, I'd quite frankly prefer we didn't bother. It is absolutely burdensome to clinicians, and it does nothing to improve the lives of patients. We did some work with colleagues at the American Medical Association, Mayo Clinic, Change Healthcare, ATA, and others during the pandemic. We did a nationwide physician survey, patient survey in multiple languages, and claims data analysis. And what we were able to sort of triangulate from all of this was where sort of, now, bear in mind, our clinical colleagues turned on a dime, and the fact that they were able to deliver sort of telehealth in the way that they did so quickly during the pandemic is fantastic. But what we saw was where remote patient monitoring was being used, 60% of the time, the clinician glanced at a summary sheet of data during the visit as they would have done just with someone taking a sort of static single measure during a routine appointment. And this is what sort of I think, and we do some of this work, especially with colleagues at VA, which is sometimes we have clinicians asking us for dashboards. Can you just summarize this information for me in a dashboard at the end of the day? And I think this feels a little bit like asking for faster horses instead of a car, right? From what I understand, and Manesh, I'm glad you're going to round us out on this important question, is, already we are asking our clinicians to go back to back with patients through the course of the day. Then there's 2 or 3 hours of charting catch up at the end of the day. Now, on top of everything, we're saying, and you've probably got an hour and a half of emails because we have portals now and you have to do async communications. Are we then going to say, by the way, you take care of 500 cardiology patients? Can you just scroll through their dashboards too before you log off and go home for 45 minutes before you have to come back tomorrow? This is not a sustainable way of doing it. To me, especially when we think of sort of these flows of data, we can't reduce them to stock points, but we need to understand what those data mean and then think about automated flags that go to the appropriate member of the care team. Every single sort of excursion, if you had a hypertension sort of population, shouldn't directly go to the physician, right? We could think about using sort of nursing colleagues. We could use our pharmacist colleagues to do MedRec. If it's a sort of stress issue, we could think about getting them connected with a meditation app. We could think about, maybe trying to get a nutritionist out to them or some kind of exercise support, a health coach. There's all sorts of things we do before we recognize that there's a patient who needs to be escalated for a physician to be practicing in the clinic at the top of the license with their patient. And unless we are thinking about this total redesign of workflows, not only are we going to sell the promise of these digital measures short, we're just going to make things worse. It's going to be more cumbersome. It's going to be more inefficient. It's going to be more expensive with absolutely no return whatsoever.
Well said.
Yeah, no, I think
Patel?
I would say that, I guess I agree on many of the fronts. I would say that our experience is not indifferent. We could even go back a little bit and just think about, now it sounds antiquated, but the electronic health record. When we placed the electronic health record in, what we ended up doing was saying everything goes to the physician. So what happens is the chart, the notification, the abnormal lab result, everything's going to the ordering physician. Understandably, I understand why. But as an example, our organization right now in cardiovascular medicine, per certain number of physicians for every about 35 to 40, we have 2 FTEs of people just helping with the inbox and my charts and stuff to make it livable for our physicians. So, and then we rightly so want to develop meaningful remote monitoring tools. Talk about heart failure and cardiovascular disease, where remote monitoring might have some of the most important issues. We, in fact, have had those implantable defibrillators and pacemakers for many years. Yet the management of that has yet again been an area where we have not, I would argue, applied science. So is the scientific rigor on not just getting the data flow, but the actions linked to the data flow the same as the scientific rigor is for what we might do if I wanted to give you a therapeutic? I would argue no. And so, yes, it's always important to have data, and people want their own data. But if we want to learn how to act on that data, we should probably apply some scientific rigor to when those things are. So I know my clinicians are saying, give me a dashboard, because they're just trying to take the fire hose and make it a little less big of a fire hose. And I agree, the workflow and the process has to dramatically change. But it gets back to what doctors want to do and what patients want and what the system wants, right? And most of the doctors want to spend time in front of a patient. I'll give you the other example. Like the biggest innovation once the EHR came out was a scribe. Initially a person sitting next to our physicians typing, and then a digital recordophone, and now something that captures the conversation and puts it in the note. So I would again say that what we really want is the human interaction tied at the right time to change behavior, and the physician making a decision around that. So I would argue that the biggest opportunity here for us is to dramatically change the workflow by assigning what parts of that workflow, what's the right person to do that, as we heard, and then what is the thing that leads to better clinical outcomes, and what's the science behind that? Because again, I'd love to, I mean, don't get me wrong, I have digital watches, I have monitors, I'd like to know how much I've exercised, I do all the things that we all think about, but I also tell my patients, like, what's your daily weight? What's your blood pressure? Some simple measures that you already could have gotten before I started trying to do all these other things.
Thank you. We have a few questions here. Let's see, one from AJ. Can you please share how has cohort identification and site identification changed with remote clinical trials? Does the geographical area served by one site significantly expand? So, Dr. Patel, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, we're actively working through that. And, I think about this now because most of healthcare at the United States level is sites, but systems. So there's been a consolidation of sets, right? So there are clearly practicing physicians and communities. And I've also been involved in a group called Site Bridge, where we're trying to bridge those clinical sites to areas where there's systems. And the way that's changed in my mind, I'd be interested in what others say, is that I think we're trying to at least take a much more holistic approach to say, where are the people in the United States with the condition of interest, and then what are the places that are delivering the healthcare to those people with the condition of interest, and what are the things we can do to identify the sites and the sites that might be able to deliver that care or trial to the condition of interest or the patients who have that issue. And what digital, or what I'll call decentralize, is allowing us to do is what I'll call allow people from farther away potentially to be linked to sites until we can get sites closer to those individuals. What we're working through at our own institution and others is what I'll call very much like what's the call center, the interaction, what's the human interaction for that person look like as you start to build that digital decentralized trial? Because that person wants to feel linked to a health system, but they also want to be linked to the protocol. So it has allowed us to think about more larger geographies, but I'm hesitant to say that it's solved, at least in our experience.
That's great. Thank you. Next question we have here from Sandeep, and folks too, please feel free. We still have time for, I think, one more question after this. Sandeep says, thanks for a really nice discussion, Dr. Patel. Can you help us in the sponsor community to address the question, well, our medical research site already has a telemedicine platform, so why can't we just use ours and not have to have another one that's provided by your study, for example? So this really is, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I don't, so I think if you're in the business of selling a technology, I want to understand the solution you're solving, right? And so, again, I'm doing a clinical trial. I want to be able to contact the patient. I want to be able to get the data in, and I want to be able to track that it's good quality, high quality data. Now, if a site wants to use a telephone, a telemedicine thing, an in-person visit, my job is not to tell them how to do that. My job is just to make sure they meet the criteria. If there's a solution that makes it easier for the site, and it fits for the site, then the sites are going to use it, right? I sort of tell people that in our practice, we used to try to figure out which catheter to give the fellows to do when they're doing a heart cath, and then I stopped trying to do that, because what would happen is the fellows would immediately gravitate to the catheter that worked the best for them, and then I would train them on how to use that catheter, because instead of trying to design the way that I should be teaching them, I started looking at what they were using and then saying I should design how I teach them to use the catheter. So I call it sort of the matrix in the cath lab. You learn how to do things and you start looking at your hands. And then when you learn how to do it without looking at your hands, you look up at the screen. And then when you stop looking at the screen in your hands, you start seeing zeros and ones. You know what's going on, right? And so I think what we're doing in clinical trials often is we take a tool and we try to fit it in or shoehorn it into the issue.
Yeah, goes back to some of Jen's earlier comments too. Jen, did you want to add to that?
Simply to underscore the importance of fit for purpose. And I think that, again, we don't lead with the tool, the widget, the platform, the solution. I think it's really important to understand the problem we're trying to solve for. Who are the humans involved? What are the systems involved? What are the different considerations? And we work backwards from there. I think the one element of this question that is really important is, to me, I saw like, I already have this telehealth platform. Can't we just use this? And we hosted an event with VA a month or so ago, and Rob Califf joined us, and he said, and everyone agreed, we are careering towards a future state where we are risking 500 point solutions of digital widgets that don't speak to one another, right? We've seen it badly enough, right? With trial portals before. Now let's add every wearable, every this, every that, I'm going to give you a visualization over the top. I'm going to give you an EMR wrap. I'm going to give you this decision support tool. The problems that we've had before risk becoming amplified if we aren't sort of thoughtful. And Lisa, some of the work that we're doing together right now is thinking about taking a beat, pausing, thinking about who are all the users that are involved before we make a decision, before we go ahead and purchase a telehealth platform. without thinking, oh yeah, we actually have a lot of physicians who do research. We should talk to them about whether this works for them too, right? We have to be fit for purpose, and we have to be systematic.
Yeah, well said. Well, work back from the volunteer. Ryan, would you like to close us out? Any final thoughts?
No, just again, thank you all for joining us here today. Thank you, Lita and the AWS team for hosting us on behalf of myself, Dr. Patel, and Jen. Really enjoyed the conversation. And again, I love the conversation around simplifying the technology to meet that end goal and meet the needs of the patients and the clinicians throughout. It's perfect.
Excellent, thank you. So I have actually put up here the QR code. If you are an athlete who plays at professional levels, or you know of one and you want to learn more about the study, please do go to the site so you can learn more. As I mentioned, we're going to be publishing the slides along with the recorded webinar. That'll be sent. A link will be sent to you within 24 hours. I want to thank my speakers, Dr. Patel, Jen, Ryan. It was a really interesting conversation. We covered a lot of ground, and I want to thank the folks out there today, our audience, for attending this Fierce Pharma webinar and submitting so many great questions. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.